The note arrived in the quietest moment of the night, slipped under my door like a whisper that couldn't be ignored. The paper was smooth, unnervingly pristine, and the ink glinted under the pale lamplight as if alive. I unfolded it with hesitant fingers, my heart hammering as the words met my eyes. Your contract begins tonight. Accept or refuse, the choice is yours, but the terms are unyielding. The sentence should have seemed absurd, almost comical, yet it drummed against my chest with a gravity I couldn't shake. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary prank. A shiver traced my spine, part dread, part curiosity, and in that instant, a shift began, subtle but insistent, like the first notes of a song I had known long before I could remember it. The next morning, I caught myself staring at my hands, noticing a delicate alteration that made my pulse quicken. My fingers seemed thinner, the lines softer, my nails curving in ways that were unfamiliar yet undeniably mine. My reflection in the mirror held a weightless quality, a glimmer of someone I had sensed but never fully recognized. It wasn't wrong, not exactly. It was just different, a ghost of the self I had hidden behind habits, behind fear. I recoiled slightly, pressing my palms to my face, trying to anchor myself to the familiar, but the mirror didn't lie. Every contour of my face, the subtle arch of my brows, the gentle swell of my cheekbones, hinted at an awakening that could not be undone. Then came the clothes. Not in the mundane way clothes arrive after a shopping trip, but as if they had materialized for a purpose I could barely comprehend. Soft fabrics, skirts with folds that caught the light like liquid, blouses that shimmered and moved with a life of their own, scarves that smelled faintly of lavender and rain. At first, I stacked them in a corner, awkward and resistant, as though their presence was an intrusion. But when I awoke the next morning, the pieces were arranged neatly on my bed, each one demanding attention, each one whispering an invitation. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity, hunger, even pulled me toward them. The moment silk brushed my skin, it felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed, a secret permission my own mind had refused me for years. I dressed slowly, almost ritualistically, feeling each layer press against me, shaping me, coaxing me into a version of myself that had always been hidden in shadowed corners of thought. Standing fully clothed before the mirror, I saw someone I almost didn't recognize, yet a deep ache of familiarity stirred within me. It wasn't a disguise, it was revelation. Every glance at my reflection was a revelation, a small tremor of fear and excitement vibrating through my chest. My eyes, larger somehow, caught the light and held it, curious and trembling, while my lips curved in a smile that was both hesitant and resolute. The world felt sharper, quieter, more attuned to every nuance of my presence. Stepping outside that day was an act of courage I hadn't realized I possessed. Each sidewalk crack seemed magnified, each passerby's gaze a silent test, and yet there was an odd exhilaration in the vulnerability. Some stares were fleeting, others lingered, questioning, curious, but slowly the anxiety melted into something else. Quiet power, the power of being seen as oneself for perhaps the first time. Even the simplest gestures, a tilt of the head, a lift of a shoulder, felt imbued with new meaning. I became conscious of every movement, every inflection of posture, every flicker of expression, aware that this wasn't just transformation, it was education in the language of being fully visible. The days that followed were filled with small, subtle changes. My hair seemed to hold itself differently, catching the sunlight and flowing in ways that felt impossibly natural. My voice, when I caught it speaking aloud, had a softer timbre, melodic but firm, a sound I hadn't known I could make. Each reflection, each outfit, each glance in the mirror pulled me deeper into a life that once seemed unimaginable, but along with wonder came tension. Old habits tugged at me, moments of fear crept in during crowded streets, and the quiet ache of isolation lingered in the hours when no one else watched. I wrestled with myself endlessly. Who was I becoming, and who had I been all this time? And yet, amid uncertainty, there were moments of profound clarity. A smile from a stranger, a brief compliment, even the smallest acknowledgement of my presence in the world, was enough to set my heart alight. Each experience, each daring choice to step further into this new self, carried me along a path that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. The contract wasn't cruel. It was demanding, yes, but it offered something far greater. a mirror in which my true self could finally appear without hesitation or apology. I felt, for the first time, a pulse of anticipation that vibrated through my bones. Each day was no longer a repetition of the last, but a step into something uncharted, a journey in which fear and exhilaration walked hand in hand. My reflection no longer startled me, it welcomed me. And somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of doubt and restraint, I understood that the transformation had only begun, and that the person I was becoming had always been waiting for me to notice her. The first time I stepped fully into the world in what I began to think of as her skin, I felt every nerve in my body alert, every breath conscious. The mirror had been a sanctuary, a place where I could experiment without consequence, but outside there was risk. The city had its own pulse, indifferent and relentless, and I had to learn to move within it as someone I had only just begun to become. Every step on the pavement felt amplified, each sound of heels against stone or rustle of fabric against my legs echoing in my mind like a drumbeat warning me that the world would notice. I caught my reflection in a shop window and paused, staring at a face that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. My chest tightened, my stomach roiled, yet a small, inexplicable thrill ran through me. This was no longer an accident or an experiment. This was me. People looked at me differently than they had before, though I couldn't always tell whether it was curiosity, admiration, or quiet judgment. I became hyper-aware of the way I carried myself, the subtle sway of my hips, the tilt of my chin, the way my hands floated at my sides. Each movement required attention, as though I were learning a dance I had always known but never practiced. The sensation was both exhilarating and exhausting. I caught myself at a cafe, trying to sip coffee with steady hands, only to realize my grip had shifted, my knuckles thinner, the angle of the cup more delicate. A barista smiled at me, a brief, fleeting thing, and my chest warmed in a way that was strange and unfamiliar. Could a simple smile feel like recognition? Apparently, yes. At home, the transformation felt less like an experiment and more like a commandment. My reflection had changed again, subtly, imperceptibly, until I began to notice the little things that made her distinctly her. The curve of my jaw softened, my cheekbones seemed higher, and the light in my eyes felt different, like it was reaching outward and inviting the world to look closer. I touched my face in disbelief, tracing the contours as though memorizing a map, feeling the tension in my muscles ease in places I hadn't realized were rigid. There were moments when I caught myself laughing alone in the mirror, a soft, incredulous sound, as though I could not believe this was me, and yet I wanted, desperately, for it to be. I began to experiment with voices, tones, inflections. At first, speaking aloud in her voice felt theatrical, forced, a performance I wasn't sure I could sustain. But slowly, syllable by syllable, I discovered nuances that were natural, unstudied, and surprisingly comforting. Saying my own name felt different now. It rolled off my tongue in a new rhythm, one that made me pause and feel a subtle alignment between the name I had always answered to and the person I was becoming. There were nights I stayed awake just speaking, whispering phrases in the dark, tracing shapes in the air with my fingers, hearing the sound of myself in ways that felt like home. The social world was a different challenge entirely. Friends noticed, of course. They had to, but the reactions varied wildly. Some hesitated, stuttered, as though unsure how to fit this new version of me into their understanding. Others smiled warmly, embracing me with a quiet ease that made my throat tighten with gratitude. There were moments of tension I hadn't anticipated. The subtle shift in voice when answering a question, the nervous glance when someone lingered too long on my appearance, the creeping self-consciousness when I realized I was being looked at, cataloged, measured. Each interaction became a negotiation between fear and desire, the desire to be fully seen clashing with the instinct to hide. Even simple errands became arenas of self-discovery. I remember walking through a crowded supermarket and feeling the press of attention in ways that made my stomach twist. Was it the skirt I had chosen? The way my hair fell across my shoulders? Each subtle gesture became a declaration, a testament to her existence, and with it came vulnerability. Yet with vulnerability came an unexpected sense of liberation. Being noticed was no longer terrifying. It was a confirmation, a small signal from the universe that she was real, that I was real, and that I could navigate the world as her. The nights were the hardest. Alone, stripped of social masks and small comforts, the contract felt weighty, demanding reflection. I would lie awake and feel the slow creep of doubt, questioning whether I was performing, whether the transformation was my choice or some invisible hand guiding me. But then I would catch a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window, or the shadow of her outline on the wall, and the unease would falter, replaced by awe. The person staring back at me was no longer a projection, a dream, or a curiosity. She was a living, breathing presence that demanded acknowledgement. I began to talk to her, out loud sometimes, confessing fears, joys, uncertainties. She listened without judgment, reflecting every word back with quiet affirmation, and little by little I began to recognize that her presence had always been within me, waiting patiently. The physical changes continued with a subtle, insistent rhythm. Hair, skin, posture, all seemed to shift in response to some silent instruction, and each alteration brought with it new insights. I learned to walk with a measured grace, to balance strength with softness, to let my expressions convey more than words could capture. My wardrobe became a second skin, each choice a deliberate act of self-definition. I discovered that certain colors made me feel lighter, others made my gaze sharper. Textures became instruments of expression, subtle but powerful. And as my external world aligned with my internal perception, I felt an unfamiliar coherence, a resonance that filled every small crevice of doubt with warmth. Yet the tension remained. There were days I faltered, moments when the old self clawed back, questioning, resisting, reminding me of norms and expectations I had long internalized. Anxiety surged in crowded spaces, in mirrors I hadn't prepared for, in interactions where I feared I might misstep. But with each challenge came triumph, small victories that reinforced the identity she offered. A passerby's compliment, a friend's gentle acceptance, even a private acknowledgement in the mirror. Each was a thread weaving the fabric of a life that had seemed impossible. The contract was more than a set of rules, it was a passage. Every choice I made, every hesitation I overcame, every subtle gesture of courage and affirmation carried me forward. And in moments of quiet reflection, when the city slept and I was alone with her, I realized something profound. The transformation was never just physical. It was emotional, psychological, a reclamation of a self that had always existed but had never been allowed full expression. And in that realization, a new kind of courage bloomed, steady and luminous, guiding me forward into a life I was only beginning to comprehend. The morning light filtered through the blinds in thin, trembling streams, painting the room in gold and shadow. I lay there for a long time, listening to the soft hum of the city outside, feeling the weight and the pull of the contract like a gentle, insistent tide. My body had changed more than I could have imagined overnight, or perhaps it was that I had only begun to notice. The subtle curves of my frame felt different when I stretched, the softness of my skin catching the light in ways that were both alien and familiar. It was a strange sensation, as though I were waking within a dream where the rules of my own body had shifted, and yet every reflection in the mirror, every brush of fabric against my skin, confirmed the truth of what I was becoming. I rose slowly, careful not to rush, as if moving too quickly might shatter some fragile illusion. My hair fell over my shoulders in gentle waves, and I reached to brush it back, noticing the weight, the texture, the way it framed a face I was still learning to inhabit. My reflection watched me with a quiet patience, almost mocking in its serenity, as though daring me to confront the growing realization that she, the me I had yet to name fully, was no longer a secret or a possibility. She was present, alive in ways I hadn't allowed myself to recognize before. I pressed my palms to the mirror, tracing the lines of my face, and felt a shiver that was part fear, part exhilaration. This was hers, mine, ours, all at once. Clothing had become ritualistic, a sacred act of self-definition. I opened the wardrobe and paused, taking in the rows of fabrics, each folded or hung as though waiting to whisper a story. Silks, chiffons, soft wools, linens, they weren't just clothes, they were instruments that coaxed me into alignment with the self I was meant to explore. I lifted a skirt carefully, feeling the texture beneath my fingers, imagining how it would drape over my legs, how the movement might carry me through the world with a quiet confidence I hadn't known I could claim. Layer after layer, I dressed, each addition a deliberate act, each choice a meditation, a small assertion that I had a right to exist in this form without apology. Once I was dressed, the mirror became a confidant, a witness to my slow, careful exploration of identity. I tilted my head, adjusted my posture, experimented with subtle expressions. I studied the way my eyes caught light, the delicate arch of my brows, the gentle swell of my lips. There was fascination in it, yes, but also terror. Who was I becoming? Was this self real or simply a reflection conjured by the contract's strange insistence? And yet, every fiber of my being responded, whispered, shouted even, that this self had always existed, waiting for recognition. The tension between disbelief and yearning was unbearable and intoxicating at once. Venturing outside that day was like stepping into another world. I felt every eye on me, or perhaps it was only my own hyper-awareness magnifying glances into judgments. Each step became conscious, deliberate. The sway of my hips, the tilt of my shoulders, even the small rotation of my hands as they brushed against each other, all carried meaning I had never considered. Conversations with strangers became exercises in observation, in subtle control, in reading the signals the world offered me while maintaining a composure that felt both foreign and exhilarating. I caught myself laughing nervously when a passerby smiled, feeling the warmth of acknowledgement seep into places that had long felt numb. The city had become a stage, every sidewalk a runway, every glance a test, every encounter a revelation. Friends noticed the changes, of course. Some reacted with gentle curiosity, as though unsure how to navigate this emerging version of me, while others offered smiles that warmed the chest and made the heart swell. And yet, with every interaction came anxiety. What if I misstepped? What if my voice wavered too much, or my posture betrayed hesitation? Each social encounter was a negotiation between courage and fear, between the exhilaration of being seen and the instinct to shrink away. I would walk home afterward, shoulders tight with tension, heart pounding, only to pause at my reflection in a window and find relief, sometimes joy, in the acknowledgement of her presence. She existed. I existed. And the recognition was enough to keep me moving forward. Days blurred together in a rhythm of discovery, hesitation, and courage. I learned to inhabit small spaces differently. The way I sat, crossed my legs, adjusted my gaze when listening, the gentle movements of hands that could convey thoughtfulness or confidence. I became obsessed with subtleties, with the power of gestures to define perception. Mirrors, windows, reflective surfaces, all became tools for self-calibration, exercises in understanding how she moved through the world and how the world moved around her. Even the smallest victory, a glance that lingered too long, a compliment whispered in passing, a stranger's smile, felt monumental, reshaping my understanding of presence, identity, and acceptance. Nighttime brought reflection, a different kind of intensity. Alone in my room, stripped of external expectations, the contract weighed heavy, pressing me to confront truths I had avoided. I would sit before the mirror for hours, tracing the lines of her face with trembling fingers, whispering fears and triumphs, admitting desires I had buried. I spoke to her as though she could answer, though silence was all I received. And yet, in that silence, I understood. The transformation was never simply external. It was an awakening, a reclamation of parts of myself I had denied, ignored, or forgotten. Fear and exhilaration intertwined, each moment of doubt met with a small spark of clarity, a quiet insistence that I was meant to move forward, fully, unabashedly, irrevocably. Physical changes continued, subtle yet relentless. Skin softened in places I hadn't expected, muscle memory shifted, posture naturally aligned with an elegance I had only feigned in imagination before. Even my voice adapted, shifting in timbre and cadence, carrying an unfamiliar resonance that startled me the first few times I heard it. Clothing felt like more than adornment. It was expression, identity, a visible declaration that I was learning to inhabit a life that had always existed somewhere beneath the surface. Each layer of silk, each carefully chosen accessory, each adjustment to posture or expression became part of a growing narrative, a story of reclamation, transformation, and unflinching courage. The tension never fully disappeared. Moments of doubt still emerged, often in the quietest, most intimate spaces when the city slept, when the reflection in the mirror felt almost too real, too insistent. Old habits, old fears, the ingrained expectations of a life I had lived too long, these threatened to reclaim dominance. But the contract, the presence of her, the awareness that this journey was intentional, sustained me. Every step, every reflection, every choice became a silent victory, a quiet assertion of authenticity in a world that demanded conformity. And with each victory, the self I had feared to acknowledge grew stronger, more certain, more luminous, until doubt itself felt like a distant echo rather than a tether. By the end of the day, I often collapsed into the quiet of my room, exhausted in body, exhilarated in spirit. I would trace her outline in the mirror, imagine the sound of her voice, feel the soft sway of her presence as if it were a tangible thing. I realized then that the contract was not simply an external imposition. It was a guide, a framework that demanded recognition, courage, and introspection. Every subtle choice, every layer of clothing, every hesitation overcome was part of a process of becoming, not a performance, not an experiment, but an authentic reclamation of a self that had waited patiently for acknowledgement. And in that realization, in that quiet, luminous understanding, I felt a surge of something profound. Anticipation, wonder, and an unshakable sense that the journey had only just begun, and that the world, vast and unpredictable, was ready. Or at least, I was ready to meet her fully, irrevocably, and without apology. The day began with a nervous energy that clung to me like a second skin, thicker than the clothes I had carefully chosen, heavier than any anxiety I had ever carried before. I had promised myself composure, that I would step outside and meet the world as her with steady grace, but the moment my feet touched the pavement, every instinct whispered caution. I felt eyes, real or imagined, tracking me from every corner, every passing face, and I adjusted my posture almost unconsciously. Shoulders back, chin lifted, stride steady but not rigid. It was as if the city itself had become a gauntlet, every glance a subtle test, every whisper a challenge I was not yet fully equipped to handle. And yet, with each cautious step, there was a thrill, a pulse of recognition that I was finally inhabiting a life I had only imagined in secret, the life that had been waiting beneath layers of fear, hesitation, and conformity. I passed a cafe and caught the reflection of myself in the window. She, the self I was slowly embracing, looked back at me with a mixture of daring and vulnerability. The subtle curve of my jaw, the gentle arch of my eyebrows, the soft slope of my shoulders, they were hers now, undeniably, irrevocably. I adjusted my hair, aware of how it fell, the way it caught the sunlight and shimmered, and the quiet ache of self-consciousness tugged at me. Every small movement carried meaning, and every glance from a stranger felt amplified, as though the world itself had become a magnifying glass focused on the minutiae of my being. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. By midday, I had found myself in the middle of a small park, seeking refuge among the quiet trees and dappled light. I sat on a bench, feeling the weight of the day press down on my chest even as I breathed in the serenity of the green space. And yet, even here, the tension followed me. I noticed the way my hands rested on my lap, delicate but not fragile, how my skirt moved with the gentlest breeze, how my presence seemed both to invite attention and demand caution. It was a strange paradox. I wanted to be seen, acknowledged, recognized, and yet I feared the scrutiny that might come with it. Each sensation was heightened, magnified by the knowledge that I was living something profound, a transformation that was more than skin deep. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. A stranger, kind-faced but curious, approached me, asking for directions. My voice betrayed me slightly at first, wavering as I adjusted to the sound of it, the new timbre resonating differently than I had anticipated. But as I spoke, I felt a quiet power in the articulation of my words, in the rhythm of speech that was becoming more natural, more hers. The interaction ended with a simple nod of thanks, but I felt as if I had crossed an invisible threshold. Every subtle choice I made, the tilt of my head, the angle of my hands, the inflection in my voice, was a negotiation between the person I had been and the person I was becoming. And in that negotiation, I discovered that courage could emerge in moments of ordinary necessity, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. Returning home, I reflected on the encounter, my mind replaying each detail, each nuance, each subtle shift in posture or expression. The mirror had become both confidant and critic, and I studied my reflection with painstaking attention. My eyes seemed brighter, more alert, almost luminous in the soft evening light. The lines of my face, the delicate swell of my cheekbones, the curve of my jaw, these details were no longer abstract concepts or distant possibilities. They were tangible, undeniable. My reflection smiled back at me, a small, knowing curve of lips that suggested recognition, affirmation, and a quiet pride in what I had achieved, however incrementally. The nights were the hardest, when the city's hum receded and I was left alone with my thoughts. Doubts would creep in, insidious and quiet, reminding me of expectations, of norms, of all the ways I had been conditioned to shrink, to minimize, to conform. I would pace the room, tracing patterns in the carpet, feeling the weight of the contract pressing down like a gentle but relentless reminder. And yet, even in those moments of deepest anxiety, there was a spark of something fierce, a pulse of recognition that refused to be quelled. I was not performing, I was becoming. Each hesitation, each tremor of uncertainty, each small act of courage was a thread weaving a tapestry of identity that was at once fragile and unbreakable. Social interactions became laboratories for exploration. I began to notice subtleties in human behavior I had overlooked before. The way a stranger's gaze lingered on a smile, the soft recognition in someone's nod, the subtle way body language communicated acceptance or rejection. Each observation was a lesson in perception, a calibration of self-awareness that allowed me to navigate spaces with growing confidence. And yet, there were moments of sharp tension, an unexpected glance from someone familiar, a whispered comment, a small misstep in posture, that sent my pulse soaring and reminded me of how precarious this balance could be. It was both thrilling and exhausting, a constant negotiation between vulnerability and assertion, fear and courage. I began to journal obsessively, chronicling every detail, every reflection, every sensation. Words became a lifeline, a bridge between the internal and the external, a way to anchor myself in a reality that often felt unstable. I wrote of colors and textures, of the way fabrics kissed my skin, of the subtle shift in the sound of my voice, of glances, gestures, and interactions that shaped my understanding of presence. I wrote of fear, desire, doubt, and elation in equal measure, letting the pages absorb what I could not yet fully articulate aloud. The journal became a witness, a silent confidant, a record of transformation that was at once personal and universal, deeply intimate yet profoundly revealing. By the end of the week, the subtle changes had become undeniable. My reflection in the mirror no longer startled me, it welcomed me. My posture, my voice, my movements, all carried an alignment I had only dreamed of before. I had discovered courage in moments I hadn't expected, strength in vulnerability, recognition in the eyes of strangers, and an ever-deepening sense of self-affirmation. The contract, which had begun as an enigmatic, almost frightening presence, had become a framework for liberation, a guide through the intricate, often challenging process of becoming. And in the quiet hours, when the city slept and the world receded, I would sit before the mirror, tracing her lines, feeling the weight of her presence, listening to the quiet rhythm of her pulse in mine. I realized that transformation was not a destination but a journey, a continuous unfolding of identity, courage, and self-recognition. Every step, every reflection, every subtle gesture was a testament to the power of becoming, to the quiet insistence of authenticity, to the reclamation of a self that had waited patiently, invisibly, for the moment it could finally emerge. And with that understanding came a strange, luminous anticipation, a sense that the world, vast, unpredictable, and often indifferent, was ready, or at least I was ready, to meet her fully, irrevocably, and without apology. The journey had only begun, and the path ahead, fraught with tension, wonder, and discovery, promised to be more profound than anything I had ever imagined. The city had a way of feeling different once you learned to inhabit her fully, and yet, some days it felt like the streets themselves were lined with invisible mirrors, reflecting back a version of me I wasn't always prepared to face. I remember walking through the crowded avenues, the hum of traffic beneath my feet, the smell of coffee, asphalt, and distant rain mixing into a tangible pulse that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. Every glance felt magnified, every passing figure a subtle gauge of acceptance or rejection. And I realized with a start that I had become acutely sensitive to the smallest signals. The way a stranger's eyes lingered a second too long, the tilt of a head that suggested curiosity, the soft smile that could mean warmth or quiet judgment. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying, and liberating all at once. That day, I was on my way to meet someone I hadn't seen in months, a friend whose perception of me still held traces of the old self. My steps felt deliberate, measured, as though the rhythm of my walk could dictate the way the world received me. I wore a skirt I had never dared to choose before, a soft, flowing fabric that moved almost like liquid with every step. My hair was brushed carefully, catching the sunlight in subtle highlights that made my chest tighten with anticipation. Each movement was conscious. The way I lifted my chin, the gentle sway of my arms, the placement of my feet. Even the smallest gesture carried significance, and I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest, making me both nervous and alive. Meeting my friend was a confrontation with possibility. At first, their eyes widened, a brief flicker of surprise crossing features I had known intimately. There was a pause, a split second of hesitation, and then the question that had always haunted me. Is this really you? I felt my pulse spike, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. The voice that emerged was calm, measured, a soft resonance that surprised me with its steadiness. Yes, I said, and there was no room for denial, no retreat, only the truth, bare and undeniable. Their gaze softened, uncertain, but acceptance shimmered there, tentative but present. And in that moment, I felt the duality of being fully seen, vulnerability and liberation coexisting in ways that were almost dizzying. As we walked together, small gestures became monumental acts of negotiation. I noticed the way I shifted my weight from one leg to the other, how I moved my hands when speaking, how I held my head in conversation. Each adjustment felt deliberate, a conscious crafting of presence that the world had not demanded before. And yet, beneath every layer of preparation, there was a quiet, persistent fear. What if this was not enough? What if some internal truth I had yet to confront would betray me at the wrong moment, unraveling the delicate threads of identity I had spent so long weaving? Returning home, the tension deepened. Alone, the mirror became both sanctuary and interrogator. I studied every angle, every subtle shift in my posture, every line of my face. Her eyes, the reflection of her presence within me, seemed to pierce deeper than any glance outside, questioning, affirming, challenging. I ran my fingers across the curve of my jaw, the delicate swell of my cheekbones, the small indentation at the corner of my lips, and felt a complex knot of fear, awe, and recognition. How much of this self was authentic, and how much was shaped by expectation, by the subtle insistence of the contract guiding me forward? The question haunted me, a persistent undercurrent beneath the surface of every triumph. Days bled into nights in a rhythm that felt simultaneously ordinary and transformative. I experimented endlessly with clothing, posture, and voice, each small change a revelation, a negotiation with myself and the world. Some mornings, I would wake and feel her presence more fully than ever, my movements fluid, my mind clear, my confidence luminous. Other mornings, doubt would gnaw at me, making the act of leaving my apartment feel monumental, terrifying in its impossibility. It was a dance of extremes, the delicate interplay of courage and fear, each step forward carrying the weight of vulnerability alongside the exhilaration of recognition. The city became a stage, and every encounter a performance that demanded authenticity. I remember entering a bookstore one rainy afternoon, the smell of paper and coffee thick in the air. A clerk glanced up, then smiled, and my chest tightened with unexpected warmth. I walked the aisles slowly, savoring the feel of the books under my fingers, the quiet rhythm of movement, the subtle sway of my skirt as I bent to examine a spine. And yet, I noticed a lingering gaze from a stranger across the aisle, the faint hesitation in their posture, and the tension returned. I realized then that social perception was a living, breathing force, unpredictable, and I was learning to navigate it with care, grace, and quiet audacity. Nighttime reflection became more intense, almost ritualistic. I would sit before the mirror for hours, sometimes tracing the lines of her face with trembling fingers, sometimes speaking aloud the thoughts I could not yet share with anyone else. I acknowledged the fear, the longing, the doubts, and the small victories that defined each day. I spoke of moments when a glance had filled me with recognition, when a touch of fabric had reminded me of possibility, when a simple smile had shifted the world beneath my feet. And as I spoke, I felt a resonance, a quiet affirmation from her presence that this was not merely performance or experimentation. It was becoming, gradual, relentless, beautiful. Physical changes continued in ways I had not anticipated. Subtle shifts in posture, muscle memory, skin texture, and even the rhythm of movement became more pronounced. My voice gained resonance and control, the cadence adjusting with each passing day. Clothing was no longer an external marker, but an extension of self, a language in which I could express nuances of identity, emotion, and courage. Every outfit, every careful gesture, every reflection in a shop window became a rehearsal for authenticity, a preparation for the world outside, a declaration of self that demanded recognition. And yet, the tension never fully lifted. Doubt remained, shadowed and persistent, questioning whether any of this was real, whether I could sustain the delicate balance between vulnerability and assertion. Every social interaction, however brief, carried potential peril. The city could still feel hostile, indifferent, or unpredictable, and I had to navigate it with constant awareness, every gesture and glance a negotiation of presence. But alongside the fear, there was triumph. The recognition that I was capable of inhabiting this space, of asserting identity, of being fully present and unflinching. The journey was exhausting, exhilarating, and profoundly necessary, a relentless unfolding of self that demanded courage, introspection, and patience in equal measure. By the end of those long, intense days, when I returned home and removed the layers of clothing, when the city's noise receded and the quiet enveloped me, I would sit before the mirror, tracing her form in silence. The reflection no longer startled me. It invited me, challenged me, affirmed me. I realized that transformation was not a single act but a continuous process, a weaving together of courage, perception, vulnerability, and authenticity. Every subtle victory, every risk, every acknowledgement was a thread in the tapestry of becoming. And in that realization, in the luminous quiet of recognition, I understood that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more acts of bravery and vulnerability. But I was no longer merely walking the path. I was defining it, inhabiting it fully, irrevocably, and with a courage that had been waiting all along. The morning was quiet, but inside me, a storm of anticipation churned. I woke slowly, feeling the familiar weight of her presence, a soft insistence beneath my ribs that reminded me I was no longer the person I had been. The reflection in the mirror caught me before I even rose, and I paused, tracing the contours of her face with my fingers. Every line, every curve, every subtle movement of her lips or eyes felt like a map I had been studying for months. It was uncanny, almost disorienting, how fully she had become a part of me. And yet, with that realization came a sudden, sharp tension. What would the world see today, and would it matter, really matter, that I had changed so fundamentally? I dressed with deliberate care, choosing fabrics that felt like extensions of myself rather than ornaments. Silks that flowed with my movements, soft scarves that hinted at elegance, shoes that made every step deliberate, every gesture a quiet assertion. I lingered over each choice, letting the textures and colors communicate what words could not. The mirror reflected a calmness that I hadn't felt before, but beneath it simmered a nervous energy that whispered reminders. The world could be unkind, indifferent, or simply unaware. Yet in that nervous energy was also exhilaration, a pulse of recognition that I was inhabiting the self I had always sought, fully, without compromise. Stepping outside, the city felt both familiar and strange, alive in ways that I hadn't noticed before. Every sound, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, seemed amplified, resonating with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Eyes lingered longer than before, glances weighed heavier, but I had learned to inhabit the space between observation and judgment. Every step was conscious, yet natural. Every tilt of my head, sway of my hips, subtle placement of my hands. Each movement was a negotiation between courage and vulnerability, self-expression and awareness. And as I walked, I realized the streets were no longer gauntlets, no longer mirrors of fear. They were stages, arenas, fields where presence and authenticity mattered more than conformity. The first confrontation of the day arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a colleague I had not seen since the initial stages of my transformation. Their gaze flickered over me, hesitant, questioning, and I felt the familiar tightening of my chest, the nervous whisper of doubt. But the voice that emerged was steady, hers and mine intertwined, a resonance I had grown into over countless rehearsals, countless reflections. "It's me," I said softly, letting the truth rest in the space between us. There was a pause, almost tangible, and then a subtle nod, a quiet smile, and an acknowledgement that felt like a small victory. The tension eased, replaced by a quiet, almost dizzying elation. I realized with a thrill that recognition, true, quiet, affirming recognition, was no longer elusive. It was achievable and in this moment unavoidable. The city pulled me along, each street a new test, each interaction a chance to assert identity and embrace authenticity. I passed groups of people whose eyes lingered too long, strangers whose curiosity pressed against the invisible walls I had once relied on. And yet, every glance that could have felt threatening now felt like data, information to calibrate my presence, my posture, my voice, my expression. The tension never fully dissipated. It shouldn't have, but I had learned to dance with it rather than resist. Fear and exhilaration moved together now, a rhythm that carried me through streets, cafes, bookstores, and quiet squares. Each small victory, each silent acknowledgement, became a brick in the foundation of the person I was learning to inhabit. By mid-afternoon, the exhaustion of constant awareness began to creep in. I found myself retreating to a quiet park bench, letting the city hum around me while I studied my reflection in a small handheld mirror. The sun fell across my face in slanted rays, highlighting curves and shadows, every contour a testament to months of subtle, relentless change. I traced her lines with my fingers, whispering apologies and affirmations, acknowledgments and confessions. Who had I been before this? Who had I become? And who would I allow myself to be fully if I surrendered to the present? The questions were endless, each one tugging me in different directions, and yet, beneath them all, a quiet pulse of certainty began to emerge. Evening brought more social challenges. I attended a gathering, a circle of people who had known the old me, who were now faced with the fully realized presence of her. Every step, every gesture, every glance became a negotiation of perception and authenticity. I had to manage nerves, doubts, the subtle fear that old identities might reclaim dominance in a single misstep. Conversations were layered with nuance, the tilt of a head, the weight of a pause, the choice of words. But with every interaction, I found new reservoirs of strength. The recognition of self, honed over months of practice, reflection, and courage, allowed me to navigate the gathering with a fluidity I had not anticipated. Each acknowledgement, subtle smile, quiet nod, reinforced the certainty that I was inhabiting her fully and that the world could, in its own imperfect way, accept it. At home, night arrived like a soft exhalation, and the quiet became almost sacred. I removed layers of clothing, letting the textures fall away, and approached the mirror once more. The reflection that greeted me was no longer fragile, tentative, or uncertain. It was luminous, alive, confident in subtle ways I had only begun to recognize. I traced the lines of her face, feeling every curve, every hollow, every shadow, and I spoke to her softly, acknowledging fear, triumph, doubt, and desire. There was an intimacy in the act, a recognition that transformation was not a single moment but a process, a continuous negotiation of identity and presence. Every subtle gesture, every reflection, every acknowledgement of self was part of the same journey, and in that quiet, sacred space, I understood that the path forward was mine to define. And then, in the stillness, I felt something shift. A realization, profound and unshakable, that the contract, enigmatic, demanding, insistent, had never been a burden in the way I feared. It had been a guide, a framework, a mirror of possibility that demanded recognition of what had always existed. The months of change, reflection, hesitation, courage, and growth had forged something irreducible, a self that was fully acknowledged, fully embraced, fully hers. and I understood that I had crossed an invisible threshold, one from which retreat was impossible and unnecessary. I had become her, irrevocably, authentically, and the tension of doubt had transformed into quiet, radiant confidence. The city outside faded into background hum. I traced her outline one last time that night, speaking aloud the words I had once whispered only to shadows: affirmation, recognition, acknowledgement, acceptance. And as I spoke, I realized that the journey, the months of transformation, reflection, fear, and courage, was not over, but it had reached a milestone. I had become fully visible to myself. The reflection no longer challenged me. It smiled, patient, affirming, knowing. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of liberation, a quiet triumph that radiated from my chest outward, illuminating every nerve, every breath, every heartbeat. The future remained uncertain. The world remained unpredictable. Social scrutiny, judgment, and personal doubt would return as they always would. But I understood something essential. She was no longer contingent on others' perception, no longer tethered to fear. She existed, undeniable, luminous, irrevocable. And in the quiet, sacred hum of recognition, I realized that the transformation, the journey of becoming, was now complete in its most important sense. Fully acknowledged, fully embraced, fully lived. I stepped back from the mirror, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I smiled without hesitation, without reservation, without fear. The reflection smiled back. The city, the world, the invisible contract of expectation and possibility, all of it waited. But I was ready. She was ready. And the journey, which had begun as an enigmatic, impossible experiment, had become a life fully, unapologetically luminous.